There is a particular kind of stillness that settles in when the day has finally slowed. When the light softens and the noise of the world pulls back, and you find yourself with a little space to simply think. If you've come here tonight to let your mind wander somewhere interesting, somewhere calm and genuinely curious, then you've found exactly the right place. Tonight, we're going to explore something that has happened to you. Not once, not occasionally, but many times throughout your life, probably without you ever fully understanding why. It's one of those experiences so ordinary that we rarely stop to examine it, and yet when we do, we find something quietly remarkable underneath. You are sitting somewhere, perhaps reading, perhaps looking out a window, perhaps lost in thought. And then, without any sound, without any movement in your peripheral vision, without any logical reason at all, you feel it. A kind of pressure at the back of your neck. A certainty, arriving from nowhere, that someone is looking at you. You turn, and there they are. A stranger across a room. A colleague glancing up from their desk. Someone you hadn't noticed at all, watching you. How did you know? You had no sound to guide you. No movement. Nothing touched you. And yet some quiet part of your mind registered what your eyes had not consciously seen, and sent you a message clear enough to turn your head. We tend to call this a sixth sense, or sometimes, borrowing from popular culture, a spider sense. But the truth is both stranger and more grounded than any supernatural explanation. This feeling, this capacity, is real. It has a history that reaches back millions of years. And it lives inside a system so sophisticated, so quietly powerful, that even now, with all we understand about the brain, it continues to surprise us. So tonight, we'll follow the thread of this experience, from the moment you feel that prickling awareness, all the way back through evolutionary time, and then forward again into the neuroscience of what your brain is doing when it senses what your eyes haven't told it. It is a journey that begins with a glance and ends somewhere much larger. We begin simply with the experience itself. Think about the last time it happened. That feeling of being observed. If you try to describe it, you'll notice something interesting. It doesn't quite fit into the ordinary categories of sensation. It isn't a sound. It isn't a smell. It isn't pain or warmth or the texture of something against your skin. It arrives, instead, as a kind of knowing, not a perception exactly, but a quiet certainty that settles in the body before the mind has had time to reason through it. For most of us, the instinct is to explain it away. We tell ourselves we must have heard something faintly, or caught something in the corner of our eye, or perhaps we were simply anxious and our minds found a convenient story to match the feeling. And there's a kind of comfort in that explanation. It keeps the world orderly, predictable, governed by rules we understand. But here is what makes this worth examining more carefully. The experience is remarkably consistent. Across cultures, across ages, across circumstances widely different from one another, human beings report this phenomenon with striking regularity. And perhaps more significantly, when researchers have tested it under controlled conditions, isolating people from sound, controlling for peripheral vision, removing all the usual suspects, something interesting persists. Not always reliably, not with the precision of a sixth sense in any mystical understanding, but enough to suggest that something real and biological is happening. Enough to ask, what exactly is the brain doing? To understand that, we need to go back to a version of you that is much older. Not you as an individual, but you as a species. Because the capacity we're exploring tonight did not appear fully formed in the modern human brain. It was built, incrementally, across an immense span of time, in response to a world that was far more dangerous than the one most of us inhabit today. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a small primate living in a forest perhaps 50 million years ago. The trees are dense. The light filters through in shifting patches. And the world is full of things that would very much like to eat you. In this environment, noticing that you are being watched is not a matter of idle curiosity. It is the difference between living and not. A predator, before it strikes, is most often completely still. It makes no sound. It produces no obvious movement. It simply watches and waits. And the animal that can detect that watching, that can feel the weight of that gaze before the attack begins and survives, passes on its genes. And slowly, across generations counted in the millions, that capacity deepens. This is the foundation of what you feel tonight. Not magic. Not mystery. But an ancient inheritance, written into your nervous system by every ancestor who turned their head just in time. And yet, knowing this doesn't fully answer our question. Because knowing that the capacity evolved doesn't tell us how it works. What is your brain actually doing in the moment that you feel watched? What information is it processing that your conscious mind has not yet caught up with? The answer begins in a place that may surprise you. It begins with the eye itself, but not with the part of the eye you think of when you think of seeing. When we imagine our own vision, we tend to think of it as unified. We look at something, and we see it. But this is a gracious simplification. In reality, your visual system is composed of multiple pathways, processing different kinds of information in different ways, at different speeds, for different purposes. And crucially, not all of these pathways pass through your conscious awareness. There is a region at the back of your brain called the primary visual cortex, and this is where most of what we think of as conscious seeing is processed. When you read these words, when you admire a landscape, when you recognize a face, that processing runs through this region. But there is another visual pathway, older and faster, that runs through a structure deep in the brain called the superior colliculus. This pathway doesn't produce the rich, detailed images of conscious vision. It does something different. It responds to movement, to contrast, to the general shape and direction of things. And it responds extraordinarily quickly. Think of it like a river system. The main river, the conscious visual pathway, carries a great deal of water. It's wide and detailed and full of information. But alongside it runs a narrower channel, older and faster, that responds first to anything that changes. That narrower channel is not concerned with what something looks like in detail. It is concerned with where things are and whether they might pose a threat. When someone looks at you from across a room, their eyes make a subtle but real movement in your direction. Their face, however subtly, orients toward you. And this older, faster visual pathway, operating below the threshold of conscious awareness, detects that orientation. It registers the shape of a face, directed at you, even when you haven't consciously turned to look. And it sends a signal, not in words or images, but in the quiet language of the body. Something has changed. Something is attending to you. This is part of what you feel. But it is only part. Have you ever noticed how much of what your brain processes never reaches your awareness at all? We tend to think of consciousness as the center of things, the place where all information arrives and is evaluated. But this is, in a real sense, an illusion of perspective. The brain processes an enormous amount of information that never reaches the conscious mind. It filters, it evaluates, it makes preliminary judgments, and it sends only selected results upward into awareness. The feeling of being watched is one of those results, a conclusion your brain has already reached, passed up to your conscious experience as a feeling rather than a thought. This process has a name in neuroscience. It's sometimes called non-conscious processing, or pre-attentive processing, the brain's ability to evaluate information before attention is directed to it. And it is far more extensive than most people realize. When you walk into a room and feel immediately comfortable or immediately uneasy, before you've consciously registered anything specific, that is non-conscious processing. When you wake at night to a sound you haven't yet identified but your heart is already racing, that is non-conscious processing. The brain is always working ahead of what we notice. The philosopher William James, writing at the end of the 19th century, described consciousness as a stream, continuous, flowing, always moving. What he didn't fully know, and what a century of neuroscience has since revealed, is that beneath that stream there runs a much deeper current. Faster, older, less articulate, but in many ways more fundamental. And the feeling of being watched rises from that deeper current. But there is something else at work here, something that adds another layer of complexity. Because the detection of gaze, the sense that someone's eyes are directed at you, involves not just a visual pathway, but an entire social processing system that is, in a real sense, dedicated to the task. The human brain contains structures that are, in large part, specialized for reading other people. For detecting their intentions, their emotional states, their attention. This is not incidental. Human beings are, by any reasonable measure, the most socially complex animals on Earth. Our survival, for millions of years, has depended not only on avoiding predators but on navigating an extraordinarily intricate social world. On knowing who can be trusted, who poses a threat, who is watching you and why. And the brain reflects this. It has developed remarkable machinery for social perception. One structure in particular is relevant here. The amygdala, a small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons deep in the brain's temporal lobe, plays a central role in detecting potential threats. Including social threats. Including, specifically, the directed gaze of another person. Studies using brain imaging have shown that when a person sees eyes looking directly at them, the amygdala responds more strongly than when they see eyes looking away. And this response can occur even when the face is presented too briefly for the person to consciously register having seen it at all. The amygdala, in other words, is watching for watchers. Even when you aren't. This connects to something else worth considering, the particular significance of direct gaze in the animal kingdom. Among most species, a direct stare is not neutral. It is a signal. For many animals, prolonged eye contact is a challenge, an assertion of dominance, or a precursor to aggression. Humans have adapted this in complex ways. We make sustained eye contact to signal intimacy, attention, trust. But the ancient coding persists underneath. A direct gaze still registers, at some deep level of the nervous system, as something that requires a response. And so the brain is primed to detect it, even peripherally, even before conscious attention arrives. What's fascinating is how this connects to what we discussed earlier. The superior colliculus pathway, detecting the orientation of a face. The amygdala, evaluating the emotional significance of that gaze. Two systems, operating in parallel, feeding information into the same conclusion: someone is looking at you. Turn around. And here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because it raises a question about the nature of perception itself. We tend to think of perception as passive. As though the world sends information in, and our brains receive it, like a radio picking up a signal. But this is not how perception actually works. The brain is not passive. It is constantly generating predictions about what is out there, and then checking those predictions against incoming sensory information. It is not simply receiving the world. In a very real sense, it is constructing it. This idea, predictive processing, as it's called in cognitive science, has transformed how researchers understand the brain. The basic insight is this: the brain maintains a model of the world. A set of expectations about what is likely to be there, what is likely to happen next. And when sensory information comes in, the brain doesn't process it fresh each time. It compares it to the model. It asks, does this match what I expected? If it does, the brain barely registers it, it simply updates the model quietly. If it doesn't, if something unexpected arrives, the brain sounds a quiet alarm. Pay attention here. Something has changed. This means that your brain is not only responding to what's actually in the environment. It is responding to discrepancies between what's there and what it expected to be there. And this is relevant to our question, because gaze, the directed attention of another person, is exactly the kind of information that a socially attuned brain would be strongly motivated to predict and detect. In a world where other people's intentions matter enormously, knowing where their attention is directed is valuable. And so the brain becomes very good at it, through precisely this predictive mechanism, building expectations about the social environment, and flagging departures from those expectations with particular urgency. Think of it like a subtle change in a familiar piece of music. You may not consciously notice every note in a melody you know well. But the moment one note is wrong, the moment something departs from the expected pattern, your attention is drawn to it instantly, before you've had time to reason about what changed. The brain is always listening for dissonance. And in a social environment, a gaze directed at you is exactly that kind of dissonance. An unexpected element in the scene. Something the model didn't predict. There is a related phenomenon that neuroscientists have called the gaze detection system, and it is worth pausing on, because it reveals something quite particular about how the brain handles eye contact. Research has shown that human beings are unusually sensitive to the direction of another person's gaze, far more sensitive than to the direction of other kinds of attention or orientation. We can detect, with considerable accuracy, whether someone is looking directly at us or only a few degrees to one side. And this accuracy is robust. It holds across distances, across different lighting conditions, across partial obstruction of the face. The brain has, in a sense, dedicated real estate to this specific task. What's more, this sensitivity appears to be present very early in life. Infants, within the first days of existence, show preferential responses to faces with direct versus averted gaze. Before language, before complex reasoning, before almost any other form of social learning, the detection of being looked at is already operational. It is not learned, or not primarily. It is, in some fundamental way, built in. This suggests something about the deep structure of what it means to be a social creature. Before we understand anything about the world, we understand, in the body, in the nervous system, that the gaze of another matters. That it means something. That it is worth tracking. And when you consider the implications of this, the experience of feeling watched takes on a new kind of significance. It is not a quirk or an anomaly. It is one of the earliest, most fundamental capacities you possess. It preceded language. It preceded conscious thought. It is, in some sense, among the first ways you ever knew you were in a world with other minds in it. But we should also be honest about the limits of what we understand. Because the science here is genuinely complex, and not all of it points in one direction. The question of whether people can reliably sense being stared at, even from behind, even without any peripheral visual information, has been studied, and the results are not simple. Some experiments have suggested a small but real effect. Others have found nothing beyond chance. The methodological challenges are considerable. How do you truly eliminate all cues? How do you account for subtle sounds, for changes in another person's breathing, for the 1,000 small signals that a human body produces when it turns its attention somewhere? These are not easy problems to solve in a laboratory. What the research does clearly support is the neural machinery we've been describing. The rapid, preconscious detection of faces and gaze. The amygdala's sensitivity to direct eye contact. The superior colliculus pathway operating faster than conscious vision. The brain's ongoing, background monitoring of the social environment. These are well-established findings, replicated across many studies and many laboratories. They explain how the sensation of being watched could arise, how the brain could reach a conclusion before the conscious mind catches up. Whether that sensation is always accurate is a different question. And the honest answer is, not always. The brain is a prediction machine, and prediction machines make errors. Sometimes they detect patterns that aren't there. Sometimes the quiet alarm rings for reasons the brain can't quite articulate, and the conclusion, someone is watching me, turns out to be wrong. What feels like certainty is, underneath, a probabilistic judgment. An educated guess, made by ancient machinery, in the fraction of a second before you've had time to think. And yet even in its imperfection, there is something to reflect on here. Something about the relationship between consciousness and the deeper processes that produce it. When you feel watched and turn to find someone's eyes on you, your first instinct may be to ask, "How did I know?" But there is a prior question, less obvious and perhaps more interesting. What does it mean to know something that your conscious mind hasn't yet processed? What does it tell us about the nature of the self, about the relationship between the person we think we are and the vast, humming machinery operating underneath? We tend to locate ourselves in our conscious thoughts, in our reasoning, our memories, our deliberate attention. But the experience of feeling watched reveals something that happens constantly, though we rarely notice it so clearly, that the self is not only what we consciously experience. That there is an intelligence operating in the body and the brain that precedes our awareness, makes judgments, reaches conclusions, and then sends us the results as feelings, as intuitions, as the sudden certainty that you should turn around. This is, in its way, a kind of gift. A vast inheritance from every creature that came before us, encoded in the architecture of the nervous system, working quietly on your behalf while your conscious mind is occupied with other things. It is humbling, when you sit with it. The part of you that feels watched is older than language. Older than thought as we usually understand it. It carries, within it, the survival of every ancestor who successfully navigated a world where being watched had real consequences. There is something almost moving about that, when you consider it at length. This very modern moment, you, in whatever room you are in, the world outside grown quiet, contains within it a thread reaching back through millions of years. The feeling that occasionally prickling along your neck is not separate from human history. It is continuous with it. We might also consider what this tells us about the social world we inhabit. Because the brain's sensitivity to gaze is not only about threat detection. It is also one of the primary mechanisms through which we connect. Eye contact is among the most intimate acts available to human beings in ordinary social life. When two people hold each other's gaze with genuine attention, not confrontation, but real seeing, something shifts in the nervous system of both. Research has documented a synchronization of physiological states between people in genuine eye contact. The brain releases oxytocin, a molecule associated with bonding and trust. Heart rhythms can begin to align. The entire system, built originally to detect threats, becomes in this context a mechanism for connection. The same ancient machinery that evolved to tell you when a predator was watching turns out to be equally good at telling you when someone truly sees you. Perhaps this is not so surprising. In a world shaped by social relationships, the detection of attention would need to work in both directions, toward threat and toward belonging. The gaze that tells you to run and the gaze that tells you that you are known are processed by the same underlying systems, interpreted differently by context, filtered through the same channels that have been refining themselves for 50 million years. This gives the experience of feeling watched a different quality when we turn it over in our minds. It is not only a survival mechanism. It is, in some wider sense, a capacity for contact. The brain's ongoing, quiet question, where is the attention in this room? Is not only about safety. It is about relationship. About the fundamental human need to know where you stand in the awareness of others. As we move toward the end of our time together tonight, it's worth pausing for a moment with something that remains genuinely mysterious. Because for all that neuroscience has revealed about the systems involved in detecting gaze, there are questions that remain open. Questions that may not be resolved quickly because they reach toward the edges of what we currently understand about consciousness itself. There is, for instance, the question of how preconscious information becomes conscious experience. We can trace the pathway, superior colliculus, amygdala, cortical processing, but the point at which all of this becomes the felt sensation of being watched is not fully mapped. The relationship between neural activity and subjective experience remains, as the philosopher David Chalmers called it, the hard problem of consciousness. We can describe the mechanisms. We cannot yet explain why they feel like anything at all. And there is the deeper question of what it means for the brain to know something before you do. Who, exactly, is the you that doesn't know yet? If one part of your nervous system has already reached a conclusion, and another part, the conscious part, hasn't yet been informed, what does that tell us about the unity of the self? These are not idle philosophical puzzles. They are real questions, and the experience of feeling watched, so common, so easily dismissed, turns out to be a doorway into them. What we can say, with genuine confidence, is this: the experience you have had is real. It emerges from real biological machinery. It has a history far older than our species. And it continues to operate inside you, right now, quietly evaluating the social world in ways you will never fully observe. There is a strange comfort, perhaps, in knowing this. In a world where so much competes for our attention, where there is always something more urgent, more immediate, more demanding, the knowledge that part of your brain is always quietly watching, always attending to the presence of others, always carrying forward this ancient inheritance, feels like something. Not magic. But not nothing, either. Something in between, the kind of thing that deserves to be thought about slowly, in the quiet of an evening, with no urgency and nowhere to be. The next time you feel it, that particular prickling at the back of awareness, that quiet certainty before the turning of your head, perhaps you'll let it sit for a moment before you look. Let yourself notice the sensation itself. Notice that some part of you has already done its work, already reached its conclusion, already sent its quiet message up through the layers of a mind too complex to fully know itself. There is a kind of wonder in that. Not the loud, performed wonder of amazement, but the quieter kind, the kind that settles in slowly, like warmth, like the sense of something understood that you didn't understand before. The brain that feels watched is the same brain that reads, that wonders, that lies awake thinking about things. And somewhere in the depths of that brain, older than any of the thoughts you'll have tonight, something continues its patient, ancient work, listening for footsteps, watching for eyes, carrying forward the accumulated vigilance of every creature that ever had to pay attention to survive. We are, in the end, not so different from that small primate in the forest, listening for something it couldn't yet name. Only now, we have the language to ask what it is. And sometimes, in the asking, we find that the answer is larger and stranger and quieter than we expected. That is a good place to rest.